Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I'm in my pre-conference post-anxiety fugue state just now. I leave tomorrow for Maryland to host the 2-day pharma conference that I organize as part of my day job. And yesterday was really the last real prep I had to get done. So now I'm just kind of waiting to put out various on-site fires and be Mr. Wonderful and host everything and do tech support and all the other crazy stuff that I do in the moment. But right now, there's nothing left to do. I even finished all the electronics packing and found the right dongles that I'm going to need and all this other stuff. So, yeah, that's the waiting game, I guess. Anyway, I'm sure it'll go fine. And by Friday afternoon, I will be back on the road decompressing and otherwise, basking in the attention of people who flew in from all over the place, including Japan, for this event that I put together. And, well, again, I'll enjoy that, but, it does create a certain set of pressures, I guess. So this weekend, I visited Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, or CXC, this festival that my late friend Tom Spurgeon launched, 8 years ago now. And I went partly to get in some podcasts with guests I wouldn't be able to see face to face, and partly to take my mind off my conference, to be honest. I had a great time out there, just talking with friends and discovering some new, to me, comics and cartoonists, recording a couple of shows, pitching a few guests for either this fall or 2024, having some late night, for me, barbecue, giving out some copies of my Haiku for Business Travelers zine, and just trying not to sweat some of the details of my conference. The big one being that the pending government shutdown was going to keep a couple of my speakers from actually speaking at the show. But on Saturday, in the middle of the conference, I saw the news that the shutdown had been averted, so I didn't have to worry about FDA not being able to talk. So anyway, everything's coming up, Gil, I guess. That means it's time to get to this week's show. So my guest this time is Rachel Shteir, who is the author of the new book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. It's from Yale University Press's Jewish Lives series, and it is a fantastic biography of a huge figure in women's rights. And I knew virtually nothing about Friedan before this, but I saw the upcoming book in Yale's catalog, and I thought, that is someone I want to learn more about. And so I zapped them and said I'd love a review copy of the book, would love to interview the author. Still not knowing if I was going to dig it or not, but I'm glad I did, because Rachel does an amazing job of bringing Betty Friedan and her changing times to light. She explores Friedan's childhood and upbringing, and how her relationship to her mother influenced not just the feminine mystique, the work she's best known for, but almost every one of Betty's steps beyond it, both publicly and in her private life. Now, I'm going to say, as a knucklehead guy, I never looked too deeply into the history of women's rights. I mean, I know, but I don't know, no? And I recorded with Vivian Gornick a few years ago, and that kind of got me started thinking about this stuff more coherently, rather than just saying, hey, it's great, women have a lot more rights than they used to. But this book really, really deepened my understanding of just how pernicious roles were in America, and what it meant to try to cause change, and what schisms existed in the movement, and how the women's rights and civil rights movements overlapped in part and diverged and clashed, and what it all meant, and how we get the fruits of all that labor without really getting necessarily, what went into it all and how contingent so much of it was and how much depended on certain key figures like Betty Friedan. And Rachel balances Friedan's life with that broader world, even as Friedan ends up getting edged out by external and sometimes internal forces that kind of push her away from the movement. But she doesn't give us this fawning portrait of a person who helped spark a global movement, but she manages to give us an idea of who this person really was and what frustrations and aspirations she had within her. And Rachel does it all in a tight, well-written 300 or so pages as part of this series with Yale. These aren't these 700 or 800 page biographies. They keep things relatively concise, and she does a fantastic job of bringing it. So I enjoyed the heck out of Magnificent Disruptor. Sorry, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. And I learned an awful lot from it. Not just that history, but in terms of the book's craft, what care can be taken in rendering a person and their world. It's a really impressive achievement, and I'm glad Rachel was up for a conversation about it. We were going to record in person, but exigencies of my day job meant we couldn't get together when she was here in New York for a book launch, so we recorded this one remotely. Now here's Rachel's bio. Rachel Shteir is an award-winning author whose work has appeared in national magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She is the author of 3 previous books: Striptease, The Untold History of the Girly Show, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. She is also the founder and current head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program at the Theater School at DePaul University. She holds a DFA in Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism from the Yale School of Drama and a BA in Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from the University of Chicago. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Rachel Shteir. What brought you to Betty Friedan?
Well,
and don't just say Yale said
no,
we'd like you to do this book.
I wasn't going to say that. I mean, what happened was about 10 years ago, I was doing a lot of freelance journalism, and I was given an assignment by the Chronicle of Higher Education Review to review or write a roundup of the feminine mystique. It was the 50th anniversary of the feminine mystique. Now it's the 60th anniversary. And other books, a couple of other books that had just come out that were on the subject of women, the state of women, which is a perennial topic, I guess. And so I had never read The Feminine Mystique at the time because, well,
that was my next question. Good.
Yeah. I did not read it. So I started to read The Feminine Mystique, and I was blown away by it. I mean, I just, it's very moving. It's very powerful. I mean, it has other issues that I'm sure we'll get into later, but on a first read, it's an amazing read. And I was really moved by the book, a lot of it. And then I read these other books that had just been published, and they were not as interesting. They were not as, first of all, they were not as they were not as ambitious. One thing about The Feminine Mystique is it was extremely ambitious as a project. And then, so either these books that were published in 2013, either they borrowed from Betty's arguments, like they were kind of the grandchildren of Betty's arguments, or they reacted against her arguments, but they didn't really mention her. They didn't really credit her. In other words, there was not a lot of, context, that this was the book that was the first punch, if you will, in a lot of ways. And so I was very interested in that. And so I wrote about that, and I wrote about how I felt that the feminine mystique was being erased or had been erased. And a lot of people really liked that piece. And that was kind of how I came to then write this book for Yale Jewish Lives.
Mm-hmm. What was it about the book that really touched you? Or I guess in that sense, what did you realize this had laid the groundwork for so much of what came in the following 50 years?
Yeah.
Well, I guess what was that archaeology like, in a sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about it briefly. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is the writing is really gorgeous in many places, and the sweep of the writing. Another thing is when you're reading the book, in a lot of places, you feel like Betty is talking directly to you. Although the book has a large scope, it's trying to take on all of society, right? It's a critique of all of society, and the chapters are divided. One chapter is a critique of Freud and his American interpreters, and another chapter is a critique of higher education, and another chapter critiques Kinsey, and so on. But throughout, Betty, I'm going to just call her Betty,
Sure.
is trying to speak very directly to you, and there's an intimacy in a lot of places to the tone that makes it very, satisfying reading. I also would say, I mean, it's not just it feels like she's speaking to you. And some of the things that come up in the book are existential dread, like the existential dread that women felt, I mean, I think that's universal. What are some of the other things? I mean, existential dread is a big one. And then being kind of gaslit by the media, for example, or by psychology or sociology. Again, I think these are things that are very compelling, but also that Betty talks about, again, she's very involved in the story. It's not just a work of general nonfiction. It also has the elements of a memoir in it, baked into it. So, for example, she talks about how when she was a magazine writer in the 1950s, she witnessed and was complicit in the creation of the feminine mystique because she heard editors talking about how they wanted to reach, the housewife, and the housewife would not be interested in politics. The housewife would not be interested in civil rights. The housewife and Betty wanted to sell articles. And so she talks about how she was complicit in that, until she wasn't. But anyway, so I find that kind of reversal, like writerly reversal, where the writer turns in on themselves, to be very satisfying.
And what was the process like for you in terms of finding the life under that, doing the research for a biography, seeing what things, as you bring up in the book, that some of how she portrayed herself in the feminine mystique may not have been 100% factually accurate, or may not have focused on certain areas.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Tell me about the research process and understanding her as a human.
Yeah, as a human. Well, that was a whole different thing. So once I got the contract and I started researching Betty the human, and
I should have said person rather than human, but anyway, sorry.
No, it's fine. And then I started interviewing people, of course, reading all the previous biographies and all the other secondary stuff. I mean, basically, as I'm sure you're aware, the general consensus is that she had some kind of a deficient character or something like that. And my experience, especially early on, researching the book was just of being overwhelmed by all the negative things that people said about her and wrote about her. I had to really figure out, is maybe not the correct word, but I had to grapple with how I was going to approach this subject, because one thing I was always really sure about was that I did not want to repeat what had been done. I wanted to try and understand why she acted the way she did, and why she wrote the feminine mystique the way she did. For example, one thing you're alluding to is that one of the criticisms of the feminine mystique is that it's not factually accurate. It's kind of sensationalist. And so I had to figure out, first of all, did I agree with that? And second of all, how, if I did agree with it, or if I didn't, how was I going to deal with it in the book? So there was a lot to deal with at the beginning, and it took me quite a while to, get my bearings.
Mm-hmm. Knowing, as you said, from the previous biographies and pieces about her, that it's too easy to go after the, we'll say, difficult person. I say this because 2 weeks ago I had a guest on who 10 years ago did a book called Difficult Men about the guys who created the great TV shows of the 2000s. And for them, being difficult is a sign of their genius.
Yes.
They treated people horribly, treated women horribly,
yes.
But we got all this great art.
Yes.
With women, of course, as you know,
yes.
it's they're shrill, they're
yes.
difficult,
yes.
they should be put in a corner and otherwise
yes.
ignored or ridiculed.
Yes.
So.
I mean, right. And so I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, this was in the back of my mind the entire time I was writing, was to a question of to what extent was the way Betty acted a result of sexism, and to what extent was it a result of other factors? I'm not going to give it a percentage, but I think that a good deal, I came to conclude that a good deal of it was sexism, and that kind of enraged me. Just recently in the New York Times, I read some opinion piece or something that talking about how women had to speak softly if they wanted raises or something, and I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that, first of all, Betty fought against, but second of all, she fought for equal pay for women, but she also, in her life, as she was articulating the goals of the women's movement, she had to contend with sexism, really from the very beginning, from the moment that the Feminine Mystique was published.
How much do you feel like she, I would say, leaned into it in that respect? Like, if they're going to treat me like this, then how much am I going to exaggerate, or become more bombastic and try to make the point? Do you see that any feedback there, or is it pretty much this is who she was and this is the moment she lived for?
I don't know if there's a red herring, a letter or something where she says, yes, I behaved this way because I was pushing back, but it was my belief that was the case. It is my belief that was the case, but that it actually dates back to her childhood in Peoria, Illinois, when, she grew up, as I'm sure you know, in a very conformist family, and she really struggled against that. She was a person of great individuality and maybe even eccentricity, and she really struggled as a girl and as a young woman with this, in terms of the rigid gender ideas of the time, and against her mother, particularly her mother's idea of what it meant to be a girl, particularly a Jewish girl, and then a woman. She did not want to live as her mother did. So, yeah. So I mean, was it conscious? I mean, I don't know, semi conscious.
Yeah, I get you. And what was the toughest part of the research for you? I mean, I know that just not having living sources that you really wanted to get at, but what was most difficult for you beyond the cracking the initial approach to understanding her?
I think doing justice to her accomplishments and also balancing everything, balancing the woman with the work. Because one of my ideas was that the work had kind of been scanted, as I said. And so I wanted to try to make sure that, her work as a whole was given its due. But then I also did not want to whitewash her character. I mean, she was, again, as you've read and as you know, she could be cruel, she could be imperious, she could be a lot of different things that are not necessarily, attractive character traits. But on the other hand, she accomplished this extraordinary feat. And I think that it's really important for people to, to look at how does someone do that? How does someone go against convention and advance this idea that is not even really in the public, the public consciousness, and how does one push that forward? I don't know if you can do that and stay within the confines of civility and so on. I mean, as you were saying, I think men have an easier time with this because some of the latitudes for behavior, at least until recently anyway, are broader.
Yeah, to me, it's one of the great achievements of the book for you is, in under 300 pages too, managing to convey not just her life and not just the work, as you put it, but work that's world changing. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're really capturing things that are happening globally in terms of the consciousness of feminism, of a number of other movements that took place during that time, and weaving that in with where she was in those moments, and bringing the personal and the character aspects to it too. It's really an amazing achievement, I felt.
Oh, thank you so much.
But what came up that surprised you when you were doing the research? What came up in the papers? Were there things that, holy crap, I did not think this was the person I was writing about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that came up was the extent to which she suffered. I think she did suffer quite a bit personally at different points in her life. I think, let's see, other things. I mean, just to circle, sorry, I'm still stuck on your last question a bit. I mean, I think another thing that I really was trying to do was I wanted to capture her whole life, because I didn't think that had been done, because in the previous round of biographies, both of them came out when she was still alive. So they obviously they weren't really able to write up to the end of her life. And I think that whatever happened in the arc of her life in terms of her moving away from the mainstream women's movement and divorcing herself from Now, she and perhaps becoming more conservative and so on, she continued to fight for women's justice until the end of her life. I mean, she was very concerned about it. She felt like there had been these enormous setbacks in the 80s and 90s, and she really wanted things to move forward, but especially after the ERA failed, she felt that things were stuck. And she saw things, go backwards, and so so I wanted to capture that, how, because I felt like that part of her life had been scanted as well, and also like um, her involvement with Israel and her interest in Judaism. But okay, just like to get back to your question, what surprised me? Sorry about that detour.
No, I love digressions and recircling.
That I think one thing was the extent to which she was involved with SLN and the human potential movement in the late 60s and early 70s. Surprised me, and the extent to which that seeped into her work and her ideas, and perhaps was a much bigger factor than I think previous people have written, that contributed to her moving away from the mainstream women's movement. She got, as you know, very involved in Esalen in 1969 when she went there, and then for the first time. But then she continued to be involved in the human potential movement, particularly with this one person, Virginia Shteir, who was a kind of family therapist and had a unconventional way of dealing with family therapy. And so, and Betty became enamored of this methodology and participated in a number of Shteir's workshop. And I think it had a really profound influence on her. And I don't think that surprised me. I mean, I didn't think that I
was this meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I just based on the other biographies, I didn't think that it was that meaningful, and it was, it had to do. The reason she pursued it was because of her marriage and also her mother. Her difficult relationship with her mother, and she was really trying to sort that out, and she had come to the end of more traditional modes of therapy. So that surprised me.
Yeah, I will say, as an aside, as a neurotic Jew with a mother named Miriam, I understand everything. That all made all the sense in the world, frankly.
Yeah. Well, did you? Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, did you see when you saw that with SLN and HPM? Did that give you insight into that post-feminine mystique?
Yeah, because she uses language from HPN in her articles and so on, and writings, beginning in the early 70s. You can find, like, I'm trying to think, what are the phrases, like the new yes. She used.
Oh, yeah, there's one or two others that you cited also in the book. That's right.
Yeah, and so
was generativity part of that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and no one ever, to my knowledge, mentioned that this is, Betty, you got these ideas from the human potential movement. I don't know. So to me, that was very interesting. I think also, and if I had been able to write a longer book, I would have written much more about her family, because that was very fascinating to me. Her, her children and her relationship with her children, and
the sections of her upbringing feel very.
Yeah,
I'll say felt on your part. They felt like something you cared about as you were writing about her upbringing. I could imagine the next generation also.
I did care. Yeah. I certainly did care about her upbringing in Peoria and her relationship with her tormented relationship with her mother. But then another thing that I did that I don't think anyone else has done is that I tracked her mother after Betty left Peoria, and to me, a surprising thing was that her mother actually did not remain the the housewife who suffered from the problem that had no name. She took over the jewelry business that her husband ran. She remarried twice. She left Peoria and moved to California. She she became very involved in a number of different things in California. She was very active. So I think that the story of Betty herself could not really see. I'm not sure she could see the story of her mother fully. What her mother actually accomplished was pretty huge, considering.
Yeah, but again, she had to frame things in a certain way to convey them, I guess. And we all have our blind spots about the people closest to us.
Absolutely.
What do you think? What do you think she got wrong? And how much did she adjust or evolve over time? Because a big part of the book is how feminism gets away from her.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah. What did she get wrong? I mean, okay, this is hard to talk about succinctly, but
we got time.
So, a lot of people, of course, say that she got race and class wrong in The Feminine Mystique. As you know, she, from the minute The Feminine Mystique was published, it was criticized for that by Gerda Lerner, the historian Gerda Lerner, and then by others. And then later in Betty's life, she was criticized for homophobia. There is language in The Feminine Mystique that today is going to read as like homophobia. And then of course she herself used the phrase the Lavender Menace. I mean, so what do I think she got? But I have ambivalent feelings about these charges. Okay, that's first of all, I want to just put that on the record so that it's clear, because I think it's important to say that the Feminine Mystique was written. The reason that it was written was not to be. Betty did not write it to start a political movement, and another criticism of the book is that it doesn't attack institutions. It's really all about the individual. And at the end of the book, it advises women to, one of the few pieces of advice it gives women is to get involved in an artistic project or, involve yourself. Essentially, Betty's saying, involve yourself in something that is bigger than you are, which is not political advice, right? It's like human or individual advice. It's advice that I happen to think is correct, but many people have been frustrated with the book because it did not at the end of it offer political advice, like what women should do to rid themselves of the feminine mystique. But what I'm saying is that was not its purpose. I mean, its purpose was to, first of all, describe this malady. And second of all, to talk about, then to like just chart out the malady as a psychological malady, as a condition, a human condition. So I guess I feel like when people criticize it for some of the things that they criticize it for, I feel like you have to go back to what was Betty's intention. Her intention was not to start a political movement. That came later. And then I think, in terms of race and class, yes, those are criticisms that can be made of the book. I mean, Betty does mention Sojourner Truth in the book. But she does. It's not about working class women. It's not about Black women. I mean, I guess. Okay, again, this is lengthy, I know, but like, I have sort of two answers to those critics. I think, first of all, if you go into the archives, there is evidence in the archives that Betty tried to include more, what we would call intersectionality, right? Like she tried to connect like anti-Semitism and sexism and racism, right? There are places in the drafts of the book where it seems like she's trying to do that. Those things were cut, or it's not really clear exactly what happened. Like if her editor cut them for length, the book was way too long, or if Betty cut them. But also, I will say, I'm going to kind of argue from another perspective now. I would also say that the book is meant to be about just women as a category. And it's meant to, create the space where, people could talk about women as a category and how women as a category were being maligned, oppressed, whatever word you would like to use in that space. And so Betty was trying very intently to create that space, and that was her focus. And I think she felt for the rest of her life, certainly, in the late 60s, after she had founded Now and identity politics began to rise, she felt that those kinds of politics were detrimental to the women's movement.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that part fascinating.
It's really fascinating.
the sort of schism between equal rights and sexual politics and identity politics, the way they I went to Hampshire College in the late 80s and early 90s. If you have a context for that, you'll understand I was exposed to a lot of that in that era. That question that everything is the personal, everything is identity.
Right.
But, go on.
No, exactly. Everything is identity. And that's where we are now. Right. I would say, we've made huge strides in terms of identity. I mean, certainly women can live in ways that were unthinkable or at least more difficult in the late 50s than they are now. Like women can live alone. Right.
Do you feel like her objection to it was that she feared the reaction from the mainstream?
Yes, I know. Okay. I know that she did. She
because you mentioned it as a potential breeding ground or soil for fascism. And I'm assuming you meant from the outside, from people who were reacting badly to these identity things, as opposed to some of the extremes of what we'll call political correctness or woke or whatever the hell you want to call it. From the inside. But
she was very concerned with. She worried that if these sexual politics, if these ideas, dominated the women's movement, then the women's movement would become a kind of niche movement, and it would not be able to, capture the interest of, the majority of women. I mean, when Betty and Polly Murray and others co-founded Now, the idea of Now was that it would be a bunch of women of different types in a room talking together and hashing out their problems, right? And trying to figure out, how can we improve? How can we reach equality? And I feel that idea in and of itself, first of all, it's been lost, right? Like this idea that women of different, who come from different backgrounds, who have different jobs, who, et cetera. I don't think that's happening right now. I think everything is very tribalized. And that's what Betty was afraid of. She was afraid that everything would get very tribalized. And then the cause of women's equality would not be able to sustain itself. And in my opinion, that's kind of what's happened. Because as I said, I think that in terms of identity, I think there have been strides made. In terms of equality, yes, there have been some strides made. Of course, like women can have bank accounts now,
Credit cards. Yeah.
credit cards. Yeah. As I said, you can live alone. If you're a woman, you can, what else? You can, there are just many, you could do whatever kind of job you would like to do, right? There are not these jobs that are divided, like,
and the want ads can't say man wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Job ads, discrimination in job ads. But at the same time, so there have been advances, but at the same time, I'm sure you are aware of, many, many news stories like, the 5 Vassar professors who are suing for gender discrimination. And then there was just a UN report saying that, contrary to what had been thought previously, women's equality would not be reached by 2030 or whatever. I mean, it's a little bit like climate change, and that, it's like we're not really hitting our goals. And it also, if you read, in terms of political representation, I mean, we really have failed because, you go back to, I don't know, the 70s, and Betty and other women were hoping that there would be a female president. I mean, there has not been a female president, and it does not look like there will be one. So for some time, and so I just think, I don't know. I think it's really, I think it's really a tragedy, what's happened.
Yeah, it's what I was thinking when you framed it with Kate Millett and Betty's fears that, again, it would be, like you say, a breeding ground for fascism or fertile soil for it, that primarily that would be from the outside, but also from within. The more there's a focus on identity, like you say, that tribalization ends up, cannibalizing a lot of other momentum or a lot of other movements because it becomes me.
Yeah, and okay, and the word fascism, you're pointing that out, and I wasn't really directly responding.
No,
It's good that you brought that up, because this is an example of where Betty uses sensationalist language. Okay, and I think reading it now, you're just like, what? It's fascism? Like, what is she? What? But she believed that. She believed that, that there would be this, I don't know, kind of not police state, but again.
But that control of women's bodies or control of women. And honestly, beginning of 2016, when January 2016, I recorded with Harold Bloom up at New Haven and asked him what he was reading. And he said, "It Can't Happen Here" by Sinclair Lewis.
Right.
Why are you reading that? He's like, because of Trump. I'm like, oh, don't be silly. Right. He's like, no, Gil, trust me, I've been around a lot longer than you have. And turned out he was right. But, I apologize afterwards. But her background and everything that led up to it, I could see that use of language at a time that everybody was coming out of the 50s and being polite and conservative.
Yes.
Yeah. And coming around on the Lavender Menace and recognizing that this was still a key part of the women's movement.
Yeah, I mean, right. So, okay. So you also asked, did she evolve? Yeah. I mean, and that's, I don't know, that's open to debate. I don't know. There were some, I don't think that she changed her mind about sexual politics and the fact that sexual politics would weaken the women's movement, although she did apologize for the phrase "the Lavender Menace." But I think that I think she continued to think that the dominance of this brand or version of feminism was a reason why it had not caught on. But she did evolve. I mean, at the same time, she did evolve in some ways. I mean, for example, I think she softened a little bit about, she also didn't think that, sexual, harassment should be a major part of the women's platform. And I think she softened a little bit about that after Anita Hill.
I found that part in the book just totally riveting in that sense.
Yeah.
That idea that she was, okay, this is more serious than she'd been treating it.
Yeah. But then I don't think she completely abandoned her old ideas either. I mean, I think at the end of her life, I think she was trying to make a case for the women's rights as human rights. I mean, she repeated that phrase a lot. And I think that's probably her major evolution. But I don't know. Oh, then I would say the other thing, there's another thing I want to talk about in terms of her evolving, which is reproductive rights. Because I haven't really talked about this like fully on a podcast.
Trust me, I have a question here that just says reproductive rights turned out to be really important, which isn't a question, but please.
Well, so she was a supporter of reproductive rights from, way, way back. And she helped found NARAL. And it was a very divisive issue in now. But then as time went on again, and she distanced herself from the mainstream women's movement, I think she began to worry that reproductive rights would be divisive. It would be a divisive issue among women. So in the 80s, especially came up when she wrote The Second Stage, which was really panned among progressives. She talks about how her phrasing is something like, she wasn't for abortion, but she was for women's right to have an abortion. And a lot of feminists felt that this was a walk back on her part. I actually happen to think that it was her pragmatism. And again, she wanted to make sure that women's rights reached many different women. But I think that's an example of how she evolved. I think she was not talking about reproductive rights as a difficult choice that women had to make in the 60s and 70s. That only really came in the late 70s and early 80s after the ERA was challenged, and also it was clear that the women's movement was stalled, and no one really knew what to do about it. There was this Republican administration that was not necessarily supportive of it. I think she felt that a more moderate position was warranted.
Yeah, that seemed to me the major transformation.
Yeah.
And one that we now see, transforming electoral politics in these last couple of years.
Yeah.
But, in my day job, I interact with Washington, and I will tell you, from the equal rights perspective, when I started that trade association that I mentioned before we started recording, it's a nonprofit, so I have a board of trustees instead of directors, and we had 12 members on the board of trustees, and only 3 of them were women. And I apologized to all 3 of them, and they all said, "Gil, this is 2 more women than any board any of us have ever been on." you're actually doing okay, all things considered. I said, yes, but neurotic Jew, raised progressive, I feel like, 50-50 would be nice.
Right.
We're down to one out of 11 right now, so I'm feeling even worse about myself. But
why is that? Why is there
in the pharmaceutical industry, there isn't, in the part that I represent, there isn't as much female representation at a higher level in the industry. There are a lot in the, I deal with the sales and marketing and business development people, as well as like quality and operations and the C-suite. And it just seems there are fewer women who are running these sorts of companies.
Right.
So it's tougher, and those aren't always the people who are on my board, but it just kind of falls out that way. And then it turns into one of these, listen, if I showed you the breakdown on this podcast of how many consecutive male guests I have had before sitting down with you, you'd be mad at me.
No, I wouldn't be mad at you, but I think it's really interesting. So you're saying more writers are men also?
Well, with the show, I interview writers, artists, cartoonists, musicians, all sorts of people. It just happened that, I once went 2 years without a person of color on the show. And when I realized that, I was like, wow, Gil, you really need to get out of your cocoon here, because there's a lot of chance and happenstance. And there were 2 women guests who had to cancel earlier this summer for various reasons. And it just turned into like 15 male guests in a row. And I thought, this doesn't look good to me. I need to start, really making sure I'm not just doing the white male thing.
It's interesting that, so this is 2023, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting though that, what does that mean? Does that mean that more writers, artists, musicians, etc. are white men even today? Or does that just mean, what does that mean?
It means I suck. It really means I suck. It just means I need to get out of my...
I don't think so. You seem pretty...
No, but it is a sign of how easy it is to fall into, who you're familiar with, and not push the barriers. And I think in your case, it was, I think I saw the book on one of the advanced review copy things, and I reached out to Yale, like, I need to learn more about A, Betty Friedan, and B, I need to sit down and talk about talk with someone who, dived into her life like this. So we do make some efforts, but it's just too easy when you do this weekly to kind of not realize the hole you're falling into. But the thing I wanted to ask in relation to all of this, the book is part of the Jewish Lives series at Yale. And you make some interesting, you draw in Betty's Judaism without being an observant Jew. More, as you put it, the Jewish tradition comes up a few times in quotes that you use. Can you talk about how Judaism not just influences her life, but how you see it playing out in her approach to women's rights?
Yeah, I think so. Just
Titanic question, I know.
So I'm always going to go back to her childhood. So going back to her childhood, she was raised in Peoria, Illinois, Reform, but in a town where there was anti-Semitism, and her mother particularly was very concerned with appearances, and both of her parents, were concerned with fitting in, her fitting in, and the family fitting in, and not being discriminated against, and but they did experience some anti-Semitism, and I think I think Betty was aware of that from a young age. But this was the late 30s, the mid 30s, late 30s, and it wasn't discussed. And then she went to Smith College, and she also experienced anti-Semitism there, of the kind that you would experience at Smith College, a kind of more genteel type.
Yeah.
And then, but she didn't, she saw herself as Jewish, but she didn't talk about herself as Jewish until much later in life. The first time, I believe, actually was after she became president of the National Organization for Women was the first time. But then it was really not until the 70s when she really began to identify as a Jew. Oh, sorry, I skipped one whole big thing though. In 1970, at the Women's Strike for Equality, when she is at Bryant Park and she's delivering her remarks, she does talk about the morning prayer, and how men thank God that they are not women. And that was, and so for her to say that in Bryant Park, I feel like, this was in front of maybe like 10,000 women. So I feel like things were really percolating. But again, people, although she, the milieu was Jewish, right? I mean, she studied psychology, right? She was interested in Freud. She was interested in Gestalt therapy. I mean, all of these things were Jewish, but in terms of her identifying herself as a Jew, that didn't really happen, except for these little moments. It didn't happen in a concentrated way until the 70s. And then she began to talk about the link between anti-Semitism and sexism, and how her early anti-Semitism had shaped her struggle against sexism, and ultimately shaped her, her great work. And in the 70s, she went to Israel a few times in the 70s and 80s, and she also became involved with institutional Judaism. But I mean, I'm describing all of this to you, and I would not say it was, I would say there's a certain amount of pushback that she had. It was not, I think, on both sides, right? It was not like a comfortable relationship between her and the American Jewish Congress, for example. There were a lot of people who thought that feminism was not good for the Jews, right? There was a lot of emphasis on having a big family, for example. And so in the 70s, when Betty was working with American Jewish Congress and other organizations, I think she would often become frustrated because she felt like she was fighting the same battles she had already fought, but just in a Jewish setting. At the same time, she definitely, especially later in life, conceived of herself as a Jew, and she went to temple, and she investigated some of the less traditional forms of Judaism, more spiritual forms. She was very interested in.
Yeah, it felt like the SLN would have led into that sense of Kabbalah mysticism that got kind of popularized in the 2000s.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think she was always a little bit, hesitant or like institutional Judaism. I think it's sometimes, there was just a lot of chafing, as I said, on both sides. At the same time, she was definitely involved in this in the 70s and 80s. She was involved in this fight that was going on about having to do with women, anti-Semitism in the women's movement. And she was very involved in that. Strangely, I don't, she was not exactly a joiner. Like she was very independent minded, and
you had that leader versus loner quote early on in the book, somewhere in the first 100 pages or so.
Yes.
Yeah. That's I just wondered in those terms whether there's a degree to which Jewishness informed, what she was doing within the movement, or if it was more just, this is all, again, as Gestalt goes, all part of her character, everything that goes into making her.
Mm-hmm.
and that sense in which blacks and Jews worked closely in the civil rights movement, and whether that can be replicated in this side was a big question, I guess. The other thing I'm wondering, did you try to reach Gloria Steinem?
I did.
For the book?
So Gloria and Betty did not really speak after like 1972. They had a big falling out. And Gloria did not really participate in the book. Because of that, I'm not, Betty, what can I say about this? I mean, Betty was very angry, I guess I would say, she was angry at Gloria. However, this was portrayed in the media as a cat fight. It was not a cat fight. It was, Betty may have been resentful. I mean, I know she was resentful of Gloria because Gloria was a media darling, and Gloria had also gone to Smith, and Smith, sort of awarded Gloria certain things that Betty was not awarded. And, I think that kind of thing was very difficult for Betty. You have to remember that in 1970, Betty was 50. And so Gloria was I think 38 or something like that. That's a big, and Betty had 3 children and Gloria had no children. I mean, it's a big difference just in terms of what is your focus in terms of the women's movement. But okay, the point I want to make is that also Betty maligned Gloria in the media, just sort of viciously. And Gloria always took the high road. She never responded. And so they didn't really speak, as I said, after 72, I think. So I'm imagining Gloria didn't have anything to add to the conversation,
Sure. I assumed, but yeah, I figured you reached out. But that sense of what she could have added to the missing parts, basically, what it meant to only have Betty's side of certain arguments, and then the people on the outside, their speculations. Yeah.
I mean, Betty was really in touch with her own rage. And
that's a good way of putting it.
And Gloria, I think I'm not sure Gloria was for many years, or at least she didn't show that. But for Betty, the rage was always like, boom, like right there waiting to be ignited by something or other. And that was part of her effectiveness when she was effective. And it was also part of what made people, recoil from her. But Gloria had a much different character. And they had much different politics. Also, Betty wanted to involve Republicans. For example, in the National Women's Political Caucus, Gloria and Bella Abzug really were not interested in that. They wanted it to be progressive. But Betty was more centrist.
Again, she was concerned about mainstream.
Yeah.
And I would say mainstream approval, but not alienating the people who are actually going to have to vote and make those changes.
Exactly. Yeah. She was concerned about middle America. She came from middle America. She was concerned about middle America. And she felt that was important. And also having children. She was very concerned with women with families. She was, she worried that the women's movement would just become a youth movement also.
Yeah. And again, when that stuff is all in process, it's one thing for us to look at it as you started doing, with that 50th anniversary, trying to get that retrospection, but seeing it as it was all happening and not knowing, what directions things would take. It's, you could see how things got as fraught as they did in terms of, the conflicts within the movement.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was enormously tumultuous, but at the same time, I think there was a feeling of hope. Especially obviously in the late 60s, but even into the early 70s, maybe, I think there was hope, even maybe until the ERA. And I think that's one of the things that's different about this time and our time is I don't think that there is that same hope that it is going to be possible to affect change.
Yeah.
And I think, I just think that's sad. And I also think, in terms of Betty, I think women would come up to her and they would say, "You changed my life." And I don't know who today people look up to who has that stature. Certainly not in the women's movement, but I mean, I can barely even think of anybody just of that stature, like in public life, and I just think that's really sad. I think we need figures, these like heroic figures, even if they have clay feet. I think we need them. It's, I think it's just, I don't know. Today, it just seems our times that we're living in are so degraded.
Yeah. I'll say Greta Thunberg turned out to be,
Yes.
we'll say inspiring, but equally alienating. I mean,
Yes.
anyone older than me just is scared when they hear her. She's so strident and scary. I'm like, because she's facing the end of the world,
right.
And you're in your 70s and she's not.
Right. That's a good point. Greta Thunberg. Okay.
But that's pretty much, if that's the beginning and end of your list, that's you're right. It's not it's a question I had, like, how much did you think about how Betty would look at today? She died 2006 or so. What would she have made? What would she have made of life from 2016 onwards? We'll put it that way.
I mean, I think she would have been very distraught and upset. I think she would have felt like there's a lot of work still to be done, and it would have been hard. It would have been hard for her. I think, I don't know, in terms of Me Too, what would she have thought of that, for example? I don't know. Obviously, Trump, she would have been appalled by that. And I think the divisiveness in the women's movement, I think that would have upset her a great deal.
Hey, can you talk about that ambivalence towards Me Too? You mentioned a Frank Gehry anecdote in the book that I think captures what her issue would be.
I mean, I think that's a situation where I feel like that is not. I think younger women probably are not gonna like or admire that. I think she felt that certain things had gone too far, and this calling out of people. She thought that it was misplaced. And she thought, again, it's back to this idea that she had. She thought that the problem with it was that it misdirected the focus, and the focus should be on equal pay, equal political representation, equal representation in business, and that sort of thing. And she felt like this kind of, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, sexual injustice. She felt like that really distracted the media, and these cases just blew up. And then what? Right? And then how were things, from her perspective, how was life for women improved? So I'm not sure she would have been able to see it. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'm not sure she would have been able to see how Me Too was, was advancing women's cause.
Yeah, I get you, and I think that gets at what I was taking away from that part of the book where the anecdote comes in. I think, it's justice, but it's not, it's not the movement, I guess.
Yeah.
Usually I ask guests about their own lives and such. I'm willing to put that off for the next time that you and I sit down and talk. Okay. But I did want to ask, from your body of books at this point, stripping, shoplifting, Betty Friedan, it's an arc.
Yeah. I know there's a little, I hear you. I know every time somebody, now that I'm doing a lot of public events, people read the list and it's like, wait a minute.
Huh.
Yeah, I don't know. What would you like me to say about that? I mean,
Oh,
obviously, what?
Well, there's always the where you going next, but
Oh, I
nobody
don't
likes
know.
talking
I
about the
don't
next
know where
book,
I'm
and
going
that's
next. I mean, I honestly don't know. I mean, I
yeah.
would like to write something totally different, obviously. I mean, but I don't exactly know what that will be.
Do you like biography?
I do. I really like biography a lot. Yeah, I love being immersed in somebody else's life. I find that very satisfying. I love being in the archives. I do. Yeah. Yeah. Why
Does
do you
that?
have a good subject that I should write about?
I just always say itinerant podcasters and dilettantes in northern New Jersey, but nobody seems to go for this as a subject. But we'll come up with something, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Although I did want to ask, from your day job, which is much more arts connected than mine, as a dramaturg and teacher within that space.
Yeah.
You're the second dramaturg guest I've had,
Oh, really?
along with
Who is the first?
Anne Cattaneo.
Oh my God, she's a hero of mine. Speaking of heroes,
Oh gosh,
she's an amazing,
yeah, and
she's an amazing person.
that's one of those. I never know. I don't want to say in niche fields, just in fields I'm not used to.
Yeah.
I sit down with someone, then I find out that they're, well, the big joke is that I was once at a book party where I was talking to an older woman who was there, and she asked, "What do you do?" I explained. I said, "And you?" She said, "Well, I'm in the ballet trade." I said, "This is going to be when I come off as a complete moron because I know nothing about ballet, and you're going to turn out to be world famous, right?" And she said, "Well, Balanchine liked the way I danced." I'm like, "Yeah, see, okay, that's me not knowing." Turned out to be Allegra Kent, great ballerina. I came off as an imbecile, but she understood. So the question I had around this, though, was biography and dramaturgy. Mm-hmm. Do you see connections in terms of the dramaturg's role, and from everything I talked about with Anne, everything you just said about diving into the archives and really getting to know someone, or in this case, a scene or a setting for something seems to overlap.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm just reading into it.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure Anne explained, far better than I ever could, dramaturgy is really about the rehearsal room, and it's about contributing to the world of the play and the context, and so it does involve that kind of archival work. I haven't done practical dramaturgy in some time, although I teach it. I feel like the skills that are necessary for biography and for dramaturgy, are very similar. You have to.
That's a much easier way of putting it than I just did.
You have to love research. You have to, you have to, I don't know, be able to talk about what's important. And sort of put things in the foreground and things in the background. And you have to be able to create a story. So I feel like there is overlap, certainly, in the two roles. And, teaching is very, that's very, I don't know, congruent with writing.
In terms of having to crystallize everything that's in your head. I get you. So we are going to talk more extensively about your life. I assume, or I hope, we're going to be able to sit down in person at some point and talk further. But I do want to ask my great closing question that I usually warn people about. In your case, I didn't. What are you reading?
Oh, actually, I'm reading Lauren Groff, book of short stories called Florida.
Some friends of mine just got to see her over in Providence or Boston.
You did?
Friends of mine did.
A friend of yours did.
They posted on Instagram how happy they were to see her.
Yeah. Every single person that I've been looking for a good book to read for a long time, and I've tried a number of things, but I find that as you get older, it's really hard. If you don't like the book immediately, it's hard to keep going with it. So I'm very excited about this book and about her in general, because a wide variety of people has talked about how great she is. And Fates and Furies people have mentioned. But I thought that since I had never read her, I would just start with this book of short stories and see how that went.
And it's knocking you out?
It is. It's amazing. Yeah, she's an amazing writer. Mm-hmm.
This is part of what I do the show for, so I'll get good reading recommendations as well as finding more guests down the line, which also helps me, keep reading and not just, goof around on my Kindle or something. So, cool. I'll have to go check her out.
Yeah.
But Rachel, thanks so much for coming on the show. And I will foist this book off on some friends of mine because, as I said earlier, you really managed to accomplish something with the sweep of a life and a historical moment that was really revolutionary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me on the show.
And that was Rachel Shteir. Go check out her new book, Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor, from Yale University Press. It's part of their Jewish Live series. I hope I got across to you in the course of the conversation how impressive a book this is. Again, above and beyond the subject matter that she's covering, but in the actual writing itself and the research, and how it draws together the personal and the historical in a world-changing movement. I enjoyed the heck out of it and learned a ton, like I said, so you ought to give it a read, too. Now, check out Rachel's site, Rachel Shteir, for more about her work and her previous books. That's RachelShteir.com. She's also on Twitter as rshteir and on Instagram as Magnificent Disruptor. All one word, and disruptor is E-R at the end, not O-R, the way I always spell it. But I'll have links to all of that in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memory Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast that comes out every week, even when the host has some crazy conference going on that's eating out his brain and destroying his life. And, well, anyway, you can help out the show by letting people know it exists. You can also help by letting me know what you like and don't like about it, or who you'd want to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by sending me an email, DM if we're connected on social media, letter or postcard. My mailing address is at the end of the Substack that I put out twice a week. Or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number. And that's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, it'll hang up on you. Just call back and leave another message. Oh, and let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I would never run that sort of thing without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, I've got a Patreon. I've got that Substack, which is free. There's a paid tier. Well, there's a paid option, but I'm not doing any paywall content. But if you want to help support the cause, you can do that. But really, my day job treats me just fine. The expenses are pretty minimal for the show. So really, if you've got money to spare, help people or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, or any of those other crowdfunding platforms. And when you're there, you'll find people who need help with making rent or covering medical bills or veterinary bills or just, trying to get an artistic project off the ground or other worthy purposes. And when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank every month, make occasional contributions to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions because that's part of my day job as a lobbyist. But I also give to Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice Funds, Freedom Funds. There are all sorts of things that you can do with your money to try to help us build a better world. So, I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.